Hi, and welcome to the first edition of a new program called The Middle. My name is Greg Norman. I'll be your host. We transformed the idea that politics is a bit polarized at the moment, and we thought it would be a really good idea to see if we can't find, as the title suggests, the middle of the road. From a polarized process with politics, athletics, and any subject you can imagine, we thought we would take a strong look at maybe presenting both sides of an argument, which might be a novel approach to news and to popular culture. So starting this week, we're going to start off with a program called The Middle. Our first guest this year is going to be Craig DeRoche, who is a former Michigan House Speaker who is now running a prison reform lobbying group called the Justice Fellowship. Craig was in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago signing the new prison reform that was signed by President Trump. And one of the few bipartisan acts that Congress or the Senate has pulled off in recent years or recent months. And we thought we would take a good hard look at the process of changing law, the idea of prison reform, and just kind of how it fits into the whole process.
Well, standing next to the Resolute desk for 45 minutes is surreal. It doesn't matter who the president is. You're in the Oval Office at an important time, and I think this president, for all of the bombastic nature of what's going on in the division in Washington, D.C., I think for his first 2 years in that session of Congress, I think when people look back at it, they're going to say that this criminal justice and prison reform bill was the most substantive policy change and direction in our country that they accomplished, that Congress and this president did. And it also signaled a change in our country, a 40-year directional change of going in one direction to now turning, the first step, but turning, going in a new direction. So it's a very, very important day, and very much privileged to be in the White House for that.
When you change the political landscape and the discussion of that landscape, everything else kind of falls into place. The follow-up to that is this has certainly been a bipartisan effort.
Right, absolutely.
On everybody. Talk a little bit about what substantively it is.
Yeah, well, the First Step Act is really two things. One is part is the prison reform, and that's where this started. And it came from the notion that we are going to use prisons in America, but we can use them in a way that works better. You know, that if you're going to take away someone's liberty, if you're going to incarcerate them, the point should be when they leave that experience, they should be less likely to commit a crime, not more likely to commit a crime. So it's a really simple notion. States have figured that out. Our federal government has a lot of work to do to catch up. The second part, which is more of a moral and rooted in our beliefs as Americans in what we believe justice is sentencing reform, where we said these sentences in that tough on crime era, we lost a little bit of our respect for human dignity and the value and worth of every human life. And so the president and leaders of Congress of both parties came together and made some really impactful changes, things like making the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive, where we had changed our sentencing laws and said that for these crimes beginning in 2010, you would only be sentenced this much was fair. But for the people that have been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole before, they were supposed to die in prison still. Right. So that's a moral question for America to reconcile with, and it was really important that fix was included in here. So the new proportionate sentences apply to people before.
One of the things I wanted to ask Craig is if the difference between rich and poor was the driving force to the way sentencing became so disparagingly unfair. At the same time, is it also the same reason that folks got together and decided that maybe it would be fair to have sort of a comprehensive compliance with the way we sentence folks for various crimes?
It really got askew, and that's why we use the word proportion a lot in the work that we do at Prison Fellowship, because that really is the base of if you take a biblical view of justice, you take a constitutional view, you look at what the courts have looked at in our country and others, is we're looking for proportion. And you're absolutely right that by introducing these novel concepts like mandatory and minimum sentences, that were meant to make things more expedient and actually make things more fair, that rich people and poor people would get the same mandatory minimum, 5 or 10 years. What it did though is it wiped out our acknowledgement of the facts of the underlying case and the value of that person's life in being redeemed. And we just ended up with these excessive and grossly unjust sentences in America.
When you can fire and find out a way to unite the left and the right, there has to be some, obviously, there has to be some commonality to the process. Where did the prison fellowship fit in?
Well, prison fellowship actually fit in. We were kind of looked at as an honest broker between that right and the left, if you will. Prison fellowship is considered more right of center. It's just the perception people have. We're a 501c3, though. We don't get involved in electioneering, but our founder, Chuck Colson, was Richard Nixon's political director, so we're still perceived as that political Christian conservative right. But great relationships with the ACLU and the NAACP and other left of center organizations that really advance this bill together, along with the Tea Party groups and the heritage foundations of the world, on shared values. So that was what made this prison reform and criminal justice reform in America unique. Was you had something where people weren't calling for a compromise in prison reform and justice reform. They were calling for something where the right and the left wanted to advance their shared values for a change, using different language, for sure, but they wanted the same outcomes. And in fact, it was really on the insistence of both the right and left that this be called a first step, because you take the Tea Party group or a Move On progressive group, they would both go much further than this bill did.
You've talked about this being sort of a first step to make the discussion about prison reform dialogue without getting into specifics, because I guess that's a lot of state regulation and local jurisdiction. Is it a first step, and how does it kind of work?
This is what I think happened in America. I think that when this debate started, the tough on crime era, which Richard Nixon, actually, Chuck Colson, who founded Prison Fellowship, he said he was in the room. Let's tough on crime, longer sentences. That narrative was adopted by the American right and left political parties. What happened is you let that run for 40 years, and it's not those people anymore, right? I think that's why that narrative was successful for as long as it was, because it had metastasized. It hadn't affected enough people. We had 250,000 people incarcerated in our whole country, in all forms of government. So it's easy for politicians to say, oh, it's all those people. Well, now you let the government run this experiment in incarceration for 40 years, and guess what? It's not those people anymore. It's our kids, it's ourselves, people like me that have a criminal record. 1 in 3 people before they reach the age of 21 are expected to be arrested. We arrest 11 million people in America, more than 11 million people a year. 30,000 people an hour are arrested, and you say that people now recognize with addiction and these other things related to criminal justice that is every single family is affected by this. And that's why the so what factor of this, when people say the criminal justice system is out of whack. 30 years ago, people would have said, yeah, for those people that commit crimes, now they're recognizing that this is their own neighborhood, their own high school, where they're sending their kids, their own church, and it's everywhere.
Have we turned courts into a for-profit business?
Well, unfortunately, we've created a lot of moral hazards and perverse incentives for our courts and our prosecutors to be kind of the modern day tax collectors, if you will, of the Bible, to say that you're going to run your operations based on the revenue that you receive. Right. And we see that from our speeding tickets on up to our criminal charges. And what we say is, not only are those moral hazards and perverse incentives that should not be a part of American life, we should fully fund our government, so they can seek justice without that perverse incentive of saying, do I actually get my pension funded or not if I do the right thing here? We think it belittles those people. The people that have these noble callings to be a police officer, to be a prosecutor, should not be subjected to meeting a quota to keep their job or to have their pension.
Is incarceration with rehabilitation more expensive than incarceration with just warehousing?
That's a great question.
Which would be part of that
Yeah.
directive, right?
Yeah.
If
yeah.
it's more expensive to rehabilitate, why spend money and just lock them up and be done with it? You got to feed them anyway.
Right. Yeah. It's turned out that the rehabilitation, every investment in that greatly reduces the cost of running a justice system. But it's the separation of who pays for it has been the problem. Again, those moral hazards and perverse incentives in a government. If I'm running a county government and I take a case and I say this is going to take me 18 months to make sure your behavior's changed, before I clean up your record or let you go from a drug court, let's say. That takes work here at the county, but if I send you to the state prison, that doesn't affect my budget at all. I can just send you to the state prison. So we have all of these other intergovernmental perverse incentives that are in place that with these pieces of legislation we're trying to unwind to say if we kept the person at that county level and really out of incarceration, and with the community correction, have a better success rate. It would cost our country less money. It might actually return a mother or a father to being in good standing with their family and return them to the workforce. So everybody wins. But the problem is we haven't constructed that in a way that makes it easy for the administrators of justice to do the right thing.
We've almost turned, as I said earlier, turned crime into profit municipally. At the same time, we're trying to figure out how to fund it. So we're collecting money, but we don't want to spend it on the rehabilitation where we could reduce the process.
Right.
So that really does screw up the formula.
Yeah, it does. And I tell people, I say, can you imagine if we allowed our armies to, the U.S. Army to collect a bounty? They would go wage war with every country on earth, to pay for their operations. But with our justice system, we do allow our justice system to pay for itself based on the people they arrest. And when you go and you look at a Ferguson, Missouri, and other things like that, it's a big part of the equation when you have 20,000 residents or whatever they had, and they had 40,000 civil fines of their residents to because a budget battle that went down on the ballot to balance the city ledgers. That creates a lot of animosity and resentment.
You've been on record over the years as a public official as the locale should be determining what happens.
Yeah.
Obviously, the closer to home, the easier it is to make a decision because you know the process better.
Right.
Does this first step bill allow us to have a better understanding and a conversation as it relates to knowing what's wrong with the system?
Yeah. Well, I hope it does, and that's something that Congress still struggles with. That one of the crimes that's a federal crime that the senators got hung up on was carjacking, and I can't imagine as a conservative myself where federal jurisdiction should be for carjacking unless you carjack somebody in Kansas and push them into Colorado.
Right.
Why that would be a federal prosecuted crime. That should be done at the county and state level. It's a horrific, violent crime. It's not something that anybody should take lightly. I can't imagine a circumstance where it wouldn't involve some level of incarceration. But states show that they do such a better job than our federal government in meeting out with a proportionate sentence, with having programming, with holding people accountable in a way that corrects their behavior, which is what the states have learned to do when somebody goes back, to cleaning up records, to giving people a second chance. And so I really think the push that you see from the civil libertarians to the civil rights groups to the 10th Amendment conservative parties all coming together around that civil asset forfeiture and other reforms are really going to take hold in this coming states' work.
Watch the evening news after this signing of the bill in the Oval Office, and you see a Jared Kushner and a Van Jones talking to each other, who obviously are political opposites. It does say something about the credibility of the process when those two can, sort of shake hands, break bread, and move forward. So I think it's a step that's needed at the moment in a world of polarization that's sort of crippled us from that perspective.
Right. It's one of the, as I say, with justice, one of the things that I think people forgot about In 2012 was the only presidential race in the previous 50 years where criminal justice wasn't one of the top 5 issues of either presidential candidate. So we kind of took it for granted. But our founders of this country certainly didn't when they wrote the Bill of Rights. You know, they didn't fight about health care or roads being built or these education systems and things like that. They knew that what made our country different was to have a different justice system that restrained the government, that made sure that human life was valued and that people were treated equally and that proportionally, and that we had a chance for second chances and redemption. And as that got lost statutorily and in practice over the last 30, 40 years, that's where you saw our excesses in, based on race and people's economic ability to hire a lawyer and things like that. And I think that justice has been a big part of dividing our country, but when you see Van Jones and Jared Kushner being able to talk at such a time as this, where there's so much polarization, that justice actually can be something that pulls our communities back together too.
If the first step in this is conversation, what is in the bill to get us moving in that direction? What specifically is written in that bill?
Yeah, what the specifics of the bill, the sentencing reforms move directly toward, I think, being consistent with our values as Americans. They changed the drug sentencing laws for the first time to go away from taking a mule, for example, that transports something from one building to another, and because of the value of what they had in their possession, treating them like they're El Chapo. We've been doing that for 30 years. The fact is, the person was an addict that was getting paid $100 to go from one building to another, to charge him for his role in the crime. That's an American breakthrough that I think is very important. You have a bunch of El Chapos out there going free because they can hire lawyers and these mules to do this stuff. And we have a bunch of people that got paid $100 for their fix for the day, doing 50 years of time in our federal prison. It doesn't make any sense. We didn't get the bad guy. We got the wrong people. This bill changes some of that around, which God willing, is only the beginning of that. I think the biggest part of the first step isn't actually the policy, though, Greg. I think the biggest part is that narrative of saying, let's get these people, let's lock them up, their life isn't worth anything narrative for 30, 40 years, from both political parties, to saying, wait a second, people need a second chance, they should be welcomed back into the workforce. That coming out of Donald Trump's mouth, boy, that's a sea change in the narrative of our country, and I think that's helpful.
I was judged things on what happens at cocktail parties.
Yeah.
And that conversation is now prevalent at cocktail parties, when 6 months ago it wasn't, because it just didn't resonate from that standpoint. And I think part of the discussion of following the money up the ladder to get bigger fish solve some of the lower, shallower ends of the pool, so to speak. And I think that's something that I'm not sure why it took us this long, but God, thank God we're finally there.
Yeah.
From that perspective. What's from a personal perspective, what's rewarding for you? And I'm asking the question as not a bullet point off of a sheet someplace, but you're smiling because I'm looking for a human moment, if you will. You obviously spend a lot of time traveling and working and doing different things. At the end of the day, there has to be some substantive success, and this is.
Yeah.
And if you're the power broker or the conduit for neutrality in this group, hey, congratulations! But what turns you on in this process?
Well, really, it's at a personal level. It's the fact that I've been given a second chance. I was arrested twice in 2010, 4 months apart. I violated my probation. I think most people that would have read the newspaper stories that day would have written me off. And for good reason. I was living in addiction. I had been for a couple of decades. I had done some tragically poor choices, as most people on the 6 o'clock news have. Most people in the court every day, it's their worst days of their life, not the best days of their life. And 8 years later, I get to use that experience to actually help people, to be invited into the White House to say, the fact that you turned your life around is what we want more of. That's what Congress wants to see, because it's not just me. It's a huge percentage of our population is dealing with these issues in their families. And so, yes, we want somebody to be held accountable. We want to arrest the behavior. We want to see that accountability play out through our system, but we want them to actually succeed. That's the change, and that's what I know is possible. And I look at it as I was given this gift of in my own life of freedom, that I want to be able to return that in policies that will work for our country.
With divine intervention putting the road in the right direction for you,
Yeah.
do you think that having that experience, good or bad, in this case at the time not good, gives you more credibility when you open your mouth and talk to politicians,
Well,
public servants?
I hope. I think in our country we don't do that enough. You know, we try to whitewash over. Everybody has issues in their life that they've had to overcome, and we, in our country, we tend to tamp those down and say, talk about your positives. But really, it's those bottoms that we come up from that can, where we can maybe have the most to give back. And so yeah, I absolutely think that experience has allowed me to help people maybe more than my experiences where I got a college degree or my business success. That's not as relevant in our culture today as my experience in coming up out of addiction and failings in the justice system myself.
One of the conversations I had with Craig was his background. He had some issues with the law probably 10 years ago, and alcohol. And I asked him the difficult question: does he have a better understanding of the criminal justice system, having gone through it? And surprisingly, part of not only writing his book, but also talking about the problem, he's completely open to having that discussion. And I found that pretty remarkable.
Well, I think that I think that I wouldn't have the experience that I have today to be relevant. I wouldn't know how to advocate the things that I know how to advocate for now, because it's not coming from a think tank world. It's not just motivated by the dollars and cents on a spreadsheet. It's not a spreadsheet solution. There's a human problem, there's a human solution, and it's informed not only by my own walk, but Prison Fellowship being the largest service provider inside of our Angel Tree program, I believe in more than 1,300 prisons this year. That's where we get our information from about what works and what doesn't work, and we're able to bring that to the political class to help them, because they want a solution. They want people to leave crime behind. We've maybe been looking in the wrong place, and we're able to provide some answers.
I'm asking the question because advocacy doesn't have to be negative all the time.
No,
we don't have a good opinion of lobbyists,
right?
And it doesn't matter the subject.
Yeah.
So my point, advocacy in this case is helping everybody,
right?
That maybe doesn't have a foot up, in the process, and I think that's the difference.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And you would never make the changes to have this first step and have those discussions if you didn't have that opportunity to have that conversation.
That's right.
It just wouldn't happen.
No, and it's a privilege to work for an organization that recognized that gap. That Chuck Colson did, that the voiceless in our culture needed that voice, and to be able to provide that. We could never do it just with staff, people like myself. We have volunteers and amazing people that contribute to our work all over the country to make this happen.
I want to ask two questions. I have a quick comment. It's interesting at this moment in time in history in our country that the John Deans and the Chuck Colsons are resurfacing at a time when we're obviously challenged at the national level.
Yeah.
What I want to ask is a time frame in your mind. If we're talking about it now, is it become talk and action? Do you think there's a time frame? Is this a 5-year process? Is it a 2-year process? When do you think we'll see some tangible results from the vocalization of this difficult problem?
Yeah. Well, I think we'll see results. I think we always need to see results relatively quickly. And I think we'll see some good results. I think that you'll see people that will be resentenced under the Fair Sentencing Act. I think that Americans will be surprised that their recidivism rate, which is the number of people that return to crime, will actually be much lower than the average recidivism rate, and they'll scratch their head and they'll say, why? Well, that was available to our country all along.
Right.
They weren't going to go back to crime, that population, we were paying for something and warehousing people unnecessarily. So the metrics will start coming out within a year or two. But over time, directionally, I think that, God willing, the Congress will recognize these things are working. Anecdotally at first, but then they'll see the metrics start coming in with the quarterly annual FBI reports, and they'll continue to go in this direction, and we'll see a second step act and a third. They probably won't call it that, but what we've seen in the states is the politicians recognize they've done something good, because not only did it save a bunch of money, and the more important thing is it reduced crime, and it restored more people from taking from the government to contributing to the government as taxpayers, and all of the other values-based things like, connections with their family and other things. And they'll say, boy, that was good, let's do more of it. And so they'll do another reform here, they'll do another reform there. And hopefully this coalition, I believe, will stand at the ready to support that action through Congress.
You love what you do, don't you?
I love what I do. I'm passionate about it.
Is this better than the first act of being a public official in Michigan?
It's far more important, the impact of what I get to do now. It was a privilege to be, a Speaker of the House, to be a minority leader in the Michigan legislature. A lot of very important things, but if I look at the value of the lives of the people that I get to advocate for, and the number of years of their lives already that have been redirected back toward freedom and redemption, I wouldn't trade this experience for the world.
If I were writing a movie script, to be effective in the position you've had to have some government experience. I think I would think that would be
sure,
important.
Absolutely.
Certainly nobody wanted to see anybody go through difficulty.
Yeah.
But having that background as a politician before, and a public official, and then going through the system, and now the advocacy that you're providing, you couldn't write a script that would fit that narrative.
No, and that's where I call it. I say it's in God's economy, because in the human economy, what I did wrong should have put me in the dustbin somewhere. Made me toxic to contributing. But the only explanation for it I have is that it's God's economy, to say, right, you mix this together, and you've got a politician that had a national standing because of my youth and other things, and was a statewide leader, and blew up his life like too many people are doing in America today, and came back around with it. So when I say I use my experience, I'm talking about all of it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
No, I get that.
Yeah.
The last part of this is a garden that you need to continually to tend as we move forward in terms of this first step.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's we're human beings, right? And so we'll always see somebody introduce a bill because they're mad about something that happened in the news the week before that would incarcerate tens of thousands of people that for 100 years, because that's what the press release said, for a crime. And we've got to moderate. We've got to look to the wisdom of the founders of this country and the checks and the balances, and that we're supposed to take that human life seriously. And we should also want that success. We should be sentencing somebody in a manner that makes it most likely that they'll never commit another crime when they've repaid their debt, not just what makes us feel like we've been the most vengeful that day.
Well, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And best of luck, and congratulations on great success here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
I wanted to thank Craig DeRoche for talking to us today on The Middle, which is a brand new program. We're going to try and hit the concepts of being sort of down the middle of the road, which is the point. Craig's had a lot of history in the criminal justice system, and there's a number of things we learned today. I just wanted to thank him for his discussion and insight. Having been in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago, he certainly knows the insides and outs of discussion of prison reform at this point as a senior vice president for the Justice Fellowship. Hopefully, as we move forward in this discussion, we can find ourselves being a little more compassionate with compliance on making the crime fit the punishment. And I think that's something that's really important. So I want to thank Craig. It's a great start to the program. And we will bring you one again next week. So we hope you enjoyed it. My name is Greg Norman, and we'll see you next time.